In the studio, Nine Inch Nails had been just me, because originally I couldn't find anybody else that was thinking the way I was thinking, and I was living in Cleveland, and there wasn't a lot of people thinking the same way, so I could just bitch about it and not do anything, or just do it myself. So I tried to do it myself, and then it became kind of fun, and got a record deal and did an album and by myself, and then got a band together to kind of play the stuff live, because I wanted to make it appear to the public to be a band, because I think it's more interesting. Now it was something I could hide behind in a way. When I started working on Downward Spiral, I kind of approached it as a big chunk of work rather than 10 songs that just happened to be written at the same time. And I tried to have a theme that kind of evolved through the whole thing. And as a kind of challenge to me from the writing end of things, going into it with no songs that I was going to put on this, it's just starting from scratch, I kind of came up with an overall concept that then split into several chunks into things I wanted to address, and then tried to write within those parameters just to see what would happen. And about a third of the way into it, I realized this is insane. I can't, try to come up with a song, and then it has to fit in this kind of spot and the theme of this, and it should be this type of music, and I realized it was a bad idea. And then 2/3 of the way through it, I just abandoned that. And then 2/3 of the way through it, I looked and realized that I'd just done exactly what I'd set out to do without thinking about it now, and the songs all fit in the right spot somehow. I realized that it wasn't going to be a big commercial success type record. There wasn't any real singles on there. And it worked as a chunk of art, I thought, but not so much as someone say, let me hear something off your new record. And it was like, better to just hear the whole thing a couple times and understand what's going on, rather than, here's a song off it, but you don't see the importance of that song unless you see how it sits in the whole thing. So, ideally, I think the record works best as a whole thing, but to try to ask people in the disposable age of, it's real easy to hit that skip button and go to the next track. I don't know if anybody really does that, but records that I'd liked, that worked as a whole, I think the whole concept of a full chunk of work is kind of dated. There's not a lot. Now it's a day of have one good song and a flashy video, and you've got a career, and I think if people buy CDs now and think, wow, if there's 2 good songs on that, it was worth buying it, in a way. Whereas in the past, I remember I'd buy a record, and if there was 2 bad songs, I felt kind of ripped off. I'm looking at, I got into music because that's what I like, I feel fortunate that I don't have to clean toilets anymore, and I can do this, and I can sit in a room and make music, And I think I've probably bummed some people out that are hoping for, Son of Head Like a Hole, or, all my classic hits of yesteryear that don't seem to keep reappearing on the next album. But when I did those songs, that's how I felt in my head, and that's where I was. When I did Downward Spiral, that's where I was for that. And I try not to be too concerned about 2 things. One, trying to please everybody what they're expecting from me, and secondly, trying to do something totally different just to be different, and which isn't true either. So subconsciously things just start to come out, and they're from the same place in my head, but my head changes, so the sounds change. So. When I started writing, I didn't have any real, I didn't know what I was going to do. I just sat down because I needed to try to do it. And after some miserable attempts at generic rock lyric writing, writing about things that I didn't know or really care about, but it seemed like the right thing to do because that's what The Clash was doing, so that must be pretty cool, I experimented with some real personal kind of journal entry type stuff. And although incredibly embarrassing to ever let anybody hear, I thought it was more powerful because it had an element of honesty to it, and it made a bigger impact I thought it made better music. You know? So after I got over that phase of, I'm working on a new song, I want to hear it, yeah, here's a tape, and I have to leave. That just kind of became a way, and then anger got more into the part of it. A lot of my frustration about a lot of things became a bigger part of what was influencing me to write, and it became just a way to channel a lot of aggression and anger and sadness, I guess, out of my system. And I'm more inspired, I think, when I'm depressed than I am when I'm happy. So I shut the door of the studio, and I sat down at the piano, and what came out of me was what I thought was really good music and really good art, and I felt foolish that it had taken me this long to remember. That's always what had pulled me out in the past. And once I started that, it just fed itself. I realized this is how could I have forgotten this? How could I have been so stupid as to forget this whole thing? So I created a bunch of demos immediately, and then I called up Alan Mulder, who was tentatively going to work on this record the year before when it was supposed to have started, and I just kept blowing it off. We both felt like we were on the beginning of a good journey, and we thought it would be a while, take a little bit of time to do this. We didn't think it would quite take as long as it did, but the record itself took 2 solid years of working.
Because you challenged yourself with a lot of new instruments. I mean, there was a quote that you said you basically picked all the instruments you didn't know how to play and picked them up.
Well, there's a reason for that, and that wasn't necessarily to learn how to play 10 instruments in the course of this record. A lot of it was...
You're not Prince, right?
Not yet. No, that's not the right answer for that. We tried to make everything on the record sound like it might fall apart, and we'd record things in a strange way. And I'd end up picking up instruments that I didn't play as well, mainly because what I'd play on it it had a naivety that appealed to me, that a perfect synth part that I know what I'm doing wouldn't have fit that bill.
Were there times in the studio, in your own studios and nothing, when you and Alan are sitting there and you're listening to tapes and tapes of songs and ideas where the album almost felt like it had a life of its own?
It did, and we didn't know what that life was. And again, it wasn't until about halfway through we really started getting more editorial and focusing on chunks to fill out the foundation and make it make more sense. And a lot more of the songs and single-oriented things came towards the end, where I also had a confidence, and I found myself as a person, as a human being. I'd been taping pieces back on and repairing myself, and feeling a bit more confident. Also to try things that I would have been afraid to do in the past.
As an album, it is a complete body of work. How can you single out one track from that album to represent it off the bat?
Well, so that's been a really tough call. And one of the first major problems we had was finding the overall sequence to the record, because I can assure you in the wrong order, it becomes unlistenable.
And that's where Bob Ezrin stepped in.
Yeah, that's where we called him right at the last week before I was going to turn the record in. And I really had, on purpose, put that off the sequencing, which I knew would be a major pain in the ass to do. So when We're In This Together came up, I knew when I wrote that track it was pretty obvious, and it's as simple as that song appears to be. That was probably the hardest song I've ever had to write and arrange and mix in my entire life. And I fought that thing for longer than I'd admit to you, truthfully, on camera, of just getting the right level of desperation and balance. And if it was too light, it sounded like a pop song, and if it was too... I learned a lot, and that was right at the very end of the record that we took that one on. I feel a great wave of optimism, and I feel like I've regained my art and my brain, and I like myself a hell of a lot more now than I did before I started doing this record. Yeah, I mean, the whole Johnny Cash thing came up at a time right when I was about to start writing this record, and I was kind of technically in my time off phase, you know, but what was going through my head was really questioning my own relevance, and I was wondering if I had anything to say or if I was any good, and just kind of really thinking about those things. And Rick Rubin, who's a good friend of mine, called me up and asked me how I'd feel about Johnny Cash covering Hurt, and I was flattered. Okay, great. And I think I kind of
assumed it would be one of 100 songs they might, try for an album. And then a while later, I got a CD in the mail. It surprised me that I felt a bit kind of invaded, like his voice was in my song, and it sounded funny to me. I wasn't in the mood to really listen. I was doing something else. And then not long after that, I got the video in the mail from Mark Romantic, and that was that's when everything kind of goosebumps, wet eyes. You know what I mean? I couldn't believe how emotionally powerful that video was, and how that Johnny Cash could juxtapose his life against my words in that song, and just felt incredibly powerful, and just felt really privileged to be involved in that in whatever abstract way that I was, and sad that it became the context in his life, and which context it ended up becoming at the end of his life. But it's a very flattering situation to have somebody that's such an immense talent and icon as him, and great songwriter, asked to sing your song, and then him turning it into this thing that really beautiful. And it felt like, it felt really, at the time, it felt really comforting and like a pat on the back in a way of like, you can do this, get out there and write an album. And, it felt good to me. Very flattered to be involved in that whole situation.
And you were originally going to work with Rick, and he did sort of, work with you and on some level, I imagine, just being a friend.
Yeah, I started this record off really pretty afraid to see if I could write. I was afraid to kind of test that out in my new world and life I was living. And I started talking to Rick, and Rick's been a friend of mine for quite some time, and it was really a good thing, a good person, a good amount of input to have around, and kind of as a mentor. When I came out to LA after that to start writing, I would check in with him and send him songs and start with feedback on that. And there came a point when a part of me just felt like my confidence had grown. I've never felt more strongly than I did at the time about what I was working on. And I felt like I need to just do this my way. I need to see it through the way I would see it through, for better or for worse. And it wasn't against me ideas Rick had. It was just every cell in my body of an artist said, just do this record the way you would do it, Because I didn't feel short of ideas, and I felt like I had a plan, and I felt like I just want to do this. I don't need to approve it by anybody. I just really need to do this thing. And I'm happy with how it turned out. I don't know how it would have turned out, and I never will, but it was, I feel like it was what I needed to do at the time. I'm not one, I don't really like to get into lyrics and what they're about that much, just because I think it kind of doesn't really matter. To me, what's always been the songs that have meant the most to me, they're what I think they're about, and it's always better than what the guy that wrote it's about, or when you mishear a lyric and the one that you've thought you've heard is better than the real one when you finally see it. But, I mean, that particular song, now that I've just said that, was me versus this disease that's going to kill me, and that was what I was flirting around with on that. A lot of the songs deal with that, but it's kind of, I like books are better than movies because you design it to set you the way you want it to look, and I don't like to have my personality or what I'm up to outside this room or overshadow what I think the most important thing is, which is, to me, the music.
Now, you said that you got sane during the making of this record. Has music always been sort of therapy for you, and was this album more so than previous albums? Music's
always been a way for me to try to feel better and get better, but I think the inspiration is coming from a less destructive place than it used to be. My life really just kind of crashed and burned. I had to come to terms with being an addict, which was something that I had for a long time lied to myself about the status of, until it really was, I couldn't lie anymore because I was either going to die or I had to get better, and there wasn't any, I couldn't go forward, and So a few years ago, I did what I needed to do to get my life in order, and took the time off because I didn't know if I wanted to do this anymore, because I'd wound up in a terrible, terrible place, and I wasn't sure what got me there, and I wasn't sure if I could even still write or if I had anything to say. And it came out of it was incredibly therapeutic, because I found that, well, I can write, and now I can actually think again, and I like myself again, and I'm more enthused about working than I think I've ever been, and I feel like I'm not kind of anchored to this black cloud that's going to take me down, you know, that's going to descend on me. And I hear it in the record now, not only thematically what I'm talking about, but taking certain chances or allowing things to sound a certain way, because I felt more confident than I had, and I wasn't as afraid what someone might think, or, you know, I felt good about things for a change. And I'm not saying it's a happy record. I don't think it's a joyous, have a party type of album. And it's exploring a lot of feelings of coming out of that cloud and trying to figure out who I am or what I am, and with a lot of fresh, terrible experiences to think about. But
now with Teeth, the first thing that I kind of struck out to me was that you know, there seemed to be more piano on it than I, you know, recall from other Nine Inch Nails records. You know, do you write songs starting on the piano, or?
It kind of changes from, it depends on what the situation is, but this record in particular with Teeth, I wrote it in a very different way than I'd written the last couple. Like with Pretty Hate Machine, the album is really like the 20th, 30th revision of the demos, you know, culmination of years of kind of perfecting it. And then by the time I did Downward Spiral and The Fragile, I had a studio to work in, so I would write in that environment and write in the studio. And what I'd find is that songwriting and the arranging and production and sound design process all became the same thing, because I was in the same room, and I was just kind of, a song would start with a sound or a drum loop or maybe an idea for a visual or something, and eventually a song would kind of emerge out of it, and that was the song. And this time around I thought it would be interesting to get back to starting with lyrics and words and really separate the process into songwriting and then arranging and production. So when I came out here, I just set up a piano, drum machine, and a little computer to record vocals into. Only allowed myself like 10 days, 2 songs at a time, over and over. And wound up with demos that were just piano, vocal, drums. And I think that's why when it got time to then take the best of the best and arrange them in the studio, which I went back to New Orleans for, I found that a lot of the space the piano took up, it sat nicely. Because I started off thinking, okay, now I have to get a cool sound to replace that, and I can't use the piano, and I've got to use. It dawned on me that, you know, it sounded good in there, you know, and it wasn't out of laziness. It was just out of, that's really kind of, there was an odd sound with like kind of violent live drums and this kind of cold, brittle environment to have a piano anchor everything together. So it just wound up that way. It wasn't really the plan, but it turned out that way.
Yeah. Yeah, the sort of contrast seems to fit with a lot of the lyrics, and I mean, is that kind of what you were thinking?
It just seemed to make sense, you know, like I went in, I started this record with the idea that it wasn't going to be lush and it wasn't going to be layered and a million different things like The Fragile was. I wanted to make it just pretty austere and down to just what needed to be there. Just if it only needed 3 parts, then it was only 3 parts. And as the songs started evolving, I think from writing them the way I described, doing demos and starting with words and simple music, they came out more like songs, you know, and less soundscapey and more like an actual thing. And the whole tone of the record kind of turned into this stripped down, for better or for worse, kind of songy type record. So it felt like the right thing to do. The way writing works now is, and this will also explain Atticus's role with me, why he's invaluable and why we're co-credited. If you sat in a room and watched, it might look like I'm the one playing the music and Atticus is the one recording the music, but really what's happening is I've found like up until the Fragile, I worked the computer, I did everything. I set the mics up, I sang the stuff, I edited the stuff, I tried to mix the stuff best I could. I backed up the hard drives. And then when we got to the Fragile, I got someone else to do a lot of that stuff under the excuse of, well, now I can just think about the music. But in reality, it was laziness. No, but what's happened now since then is when I describe the writing process where we'll sit down and cerebrally think about stuff, you know, we're not speaking too abstract, we're talking very tangibly about what do we want, how do we achieve it, what's the best stuff, should we try this, we could try some of that. Maybe we won't do anything that involves a sequencer, and there'll be no grid, okay, or everything will be performed as though it's on tape, or might be to tape, or whatever it might be. Then it switches into, I don't want to think about any of that stuff, and I can go in my head and just write things. And like pretty much all the songs on Social Network, all the tracks, came from, generally speaking, one long performance that would start. He starts recording, maybe there is a piano set up, and there's also some loops or various synthesizer or modular synthesizer with a certain type of sound. And then we'll just go, and I'll hone in on a part, say on a piano, and then I'll nod at him, and he's got it. And I'm hearing that in my head now, and he knows what I liked from it. And I'll go to the part that I think would be nice to work with that, even though I'm not hearing that anymore. And then without stopping, we'll go to something else, and I realize, oh, accidentally, that kind of sounds like a bass. Let me try this rhythm. And that can go in 1 hour, half-hour long chunk. Then it usually reaches a point where I'm frustrated and it's run out. Then I'll leave the room, and he'll sit in there for an hour and call me back in, and now it's, the pieces I heard are now arranged into something that isn't exactly what I heard, but it's better than how I remember hearing it because he picked the best stuff. And he may have tuned something up and created something out of something I didn't realize I did. And we get a lot done, and it's inspiring. So instead of what I would have had to done in the past is take a break, now have to go through all that stuff I just did and get pissed off because that sucked and that wasn't quite right. And it ends up being, he's not just arranging, it's kind of, it really we complement each other, you know, and we have an understanding where we don't even have to speak a lot of times, and we know what, I feel like when I leave, it's going to be better than how I hear it in my head. When I come back, it is, and then we take it up from there. You know, it really is a nice working relationship we have.
On Pretty Hate Machine, there were, you could kind of tell the influences of the time. In fact, I think on your liner notes, you actually even like gave shout outs to Jane's Addiction and Prince and whatnot. Who inspires you today?
That's a good question. That's the question usually along with who are you listening to now that my mind immediately goes blank.
Right.
We pay attention to what's happening currently, but we still reach back into a familiar kind of shelf of material that we find to be far more important influences, and you would know what those are: the Bowies,
Sure.
Lou Reed, Suicide, Soft Cell, Jesus Mary Chain. You know, there's no real surprises there, but what we'll find is we'll every week or so say, hey, your homework, listen to this one on your drives back and forth. You know, and it might be, the other day it was Transformer, which I hadn't listened to for maybe a year.
Yeah.
You know? But just the sound of it, the freshness, the lyrics, the songwriting, feels like breaths of fresh air. You know, we're not getting a lot of, this could be our age or culture or anything else, but we're not that in tune. We're not engaged, and we certainly don't feel any pressure to participate in the same kind of current trends that are happening.